Good evening. Good evening and welcome to this Faith in the City lecture. This is a new initiative, well, it's tautology, isn't it? This initiative has come from the Friends of St Andrew's Cathedral. You might not have heard of the Friends before, but if you look around where you're seated, you might find a small card like this. And so we're encouraging regular visitors, worshippers, and maybe occasional visitors to register as friends of this cathedral. So we would encourage you to take a card and fill it in this evening and then leave it at the back of the cathedral. And then we'll be able to keep in touch with you through the decade of development ahead of us as we work on various aspects of the life of this cathedral. Important to us is connecting with the city in which we are set. And so this lecture, we hope, will be an annual event. And so this evening, I'm very pleased to welcome Professor Gordon Graham, who will be speaking first to us, and then the Lord Provost, Barney Crockett, known to many of us as a good friend of this cathedral. After they have spoken, there will be an opportunity for you to ask questions, and I will guide you through that part of the evening. And then as the lecture and the questions come to an end, there will be refreshments afterwards. I imagine that some of you might have questions that you don't want to ask in front of everyone, and so you'll be able to ask them one-to-one afterwards, and the refreshments will be available to my left. Professor Gordon Graham, Fellow of the Royal Society of Edinburgh, also lives in Edinburgh, where he serves as Director of the Edinburgh Sacred Arts Foundation. He is a graduate of the Universities of St Andrews and Durham. He was born in Ireland and was Regius Professor of Moral Philosophy at the University of Aberdeen from 1995 to 2005. He has published extensively on topics in ethics, politics, art, and religion. His books include The Internet, A Philosophical Inquiry, Ethics and International Relations, Scottish Philosophy in the 19th and 20th centuries, and Philosophy, Art and Religion. As you might expect, he will be pulling together a number of the threads of his own learning and thinking this evening, and helping us to reflect on what faith in the city might mean. Professor Graham.
Thank you very much. It's a privilege to be giving this lecture, but I can't claim to be a distinguished guest lecturer, because this is old tramping ground. I was ordained here, as a matter of fact, and attended service here for many years while I was at the University of Aberdeen. So I'm speaking partly as an insider and partly as somebody bringing, I hope, a different perspective. My theme is the relationship between the church in the city and the city. And I want to start with an anecdote, a couple of anecdotes. When I was teaching at the University of Aberdeen, two students from sociology came to see me. They were doing a project and they just wanted to get my take on the thing that interested them. And what interested them was, why is it, and what are we to make of the fact that so many churches in Aberdeen have not merely closed down, but are being turned into quite different kind of ventures, into often clubs and restaurants. They thought that this was a mark not just of change of use, but of a cultural shift. And I think they were right about that. It wasn't something happening only in Aberdeen, of course. A few years later, I was on the top of a bus in Edinburgh, and it was festival time, and two kids in front of me were talking, and as we passed some churches that were fringe venues, even, as a matter of fact, the one we were passing was a functioning church, one kid said to the other, "Why are so many churches venues in the festival?" And absolutely straightforwardly, the other kid replied, "Because nobody has any use for them as churches anymore." And that, of course, captured a view that was just naturally there. And it is true that this was very striking to me in Aberdeen. In the 10 years that I was here, no fewer than 10 city centre churches closed. And many of them were taken over by other users of clubs and pubs and cafes. In fact, I had a little altercation about this because something had crept in which some of these places started using names that had a kind of religious resonance, Soul or the Abbey. And at that time I lived in the Hardgate, and at the top of the Hardgate was what had been a church. For those of you really in the know, it was Charlie's nightclub, but it was taken over by new management and they renamed it the Cross. And they started putting up crosses on it. And I thought this was an offence. And I wrote to the new developers and protested. "Oh," they said, "this is quite common. It just refers to the past." And they pointed my attention to these other places. And it was only actually when the then Lord Provost, John Reynolds, took an interest in this and raised the issue that eventually they backtracked and changed the name. But it was just a little indication of how far the commercial world and the commercial culture had been dislodging the church. An indication, you might say, not implausibly, of how nurturing the soul and the spirit had been displaced by nurturing the body, and entertainment had replaced anything looking like inspiration and enlightenment. Now, if you fast forward for a few years, here's an interesting thing. That commercial enterprise that had invaded the space that the church was losing, maybe even pushing the church out, itself suddenly started to encounter difficulties. It has been much talked about now in newspapers and press about the decline of the high street. That term, the high street, incidentally, covers a number of different locations. But I read just this week that no fewer than 1/3 of all the banks in Scotland have closed. 1/3. And although Aberdeen is doing, from what I can tell, rather better than many places, and its streets not as markedly declining, nonetheless, as I walked around, I was able to count a great many premises in Union Street and King Street and George Street with to let signs boarded up. So that even here, although there's a lot of vitality, vibrant even, nonetheless the signs are there, and I was struck by some of them where the advertisements to let said prime location, prime location. And you can't quite avoid the thought, not anymore. Is there any connection between the decline of the churches and the decline of the commercial spaces and activities that seem to displace them? Is there anything that might lie behind these things. I want to just enter here a word of sort of caution and warning to myself as much as to anybody else. Every generation, it seems, has a strong tendency to lament the good old days. My father always said there were no good old days, and I think that is true. It is tempting to see changes taking place and to think that they are more significant than they are. And also to believe that we have an explanation, an understanding of those changes that actually doesn't take into account the whole story. So let me be straightforward now and point to quite other aspects and dimensions that we have to remember. So when those students came to see me those years ago, I had to tell them, not with great pleasure, but I had to tell them that one of the reasons that so many churches in Aberdeen had closed was because in the late 19th century there was a bonanza of vanity projects that built them in the first place. So it wasn't that there was a time when people demanded more churches. No, it was rather that there was denominational rivalry, and there were wealthy people who wanted to see their wealth take that form. So let's be honest about that. And on the other side, let's be honest that the decline of the high street is in many cases at the effect of something that is really very, very new in the last 10 years. Not just the internet, which is with us 30 years, I guess, but of course the astonishing invention of the smartphone. And that, it's hard to remember that the smartphones are only 12 years old, and yet they've taken over. And so the commercial sector and the high street, I mentioned the banks, that's one, have been subverted, if you like, by online exchanges of one form or another. And what explains that? Well, partly it's convenience and value and choice, all those things that consumers want. So we have to take on board this fact, when we're thinking about these things, that the commercial sector in the high street has not always kept up with actually what best serves the consumer, and that there will always be these cycles, and the retail parks that were once so booming and so fashionable are declining for that reason. But still, even when we have entered these qualifications, I think there is something important at work in the background here. And I will just name that as the rise of the sovereign individual. It's part actually of a whole educational and cultural ideal. The ideal that might be captured in a phrase, you must do what you want to do. You must be what you want to be. Don't let the world hold you back. The world is yours to make your life as you want it to be. Having spent so long in the world of education, I have heard that sentiment, or something like it, spoken again and again and again. So that the sovereignty of the individual has become very, very significant. What is the cost of that? What is the cost of that emphasis on the individual across the board? And I think the answer is the cost has been community and communities. And this is really what I want to dwell upon. But it should be clear from these remarks that there are great global tendencies here. There are great changes afoot, and you might think, and rightly so, you might think, how are we to do anything in the face of this, either as churches or other forms of communities? I mean, for example, I mentioned the high street, and that's the language that people, but if you look around beyond town centres at neighbourhoods, you will see, I'm very aware of this in Edinburgh where I now live, that neighbourhood shops, neighbourhood facilities are boarded up and gone, or being converted into residential. Neighbourhoods, almost, you might say, don't exist anymore. Here and there, but not in the way they once did. And that decline of neighbourhood and the decline of churches and the dominance of online is a reflection of individuality and individualism being supreme. Let me just give you a clear demonstration. You can find it any day yourself, I'm sure. And this has been remarked upon in the last few years many times. And I can say from conversations I've had that it is a serious concern now to experimental psychologists. But it's a little bit of a joke, but not a joke. That if you go to restaurants and cafes, you will see groups of people all fixed on their phones. They're not talking one to another. Even people on dates aren't talking one to another. We know this, we see it. Why is that? Why is that? I think it is because, for whatever reason, satisfying the needs of the individual for interest, combating boredom, following things that interest them, these things are deeply fragmenting to relationships and community. And I have been on trains, I'm sure you have, and buses in which you look along the line, everybody is in, as I should put it, their own world. Well, given that this is such a huge thing, I mean, who are we to stand against these trends? We may lament them, we may worry about them, we may hope they will modify, but you might think, what are we to do? Anything? Anything? And here's what I want to think about. My watchword would be this. Watch what you say, or if you like, mind how you talk. What do I mean by that? I mean that both the church and our community, I will come to the city soon, both the church and the city can inadvertently fall into ways of thinking that instead of resisting these pressures against community, actually inadvertently, not deliberately, but inadvertently capitulate to it. And that's through the language we use. In Romeo and Juliet, Shakespeare has the famous lines, "What's in a name? A rose by any other name would smell as sweet." This sounds like common sense beautifully expressed. But whilst it may be true of things like roses, actually the names we apply to things, the words we use, are more powerful than that. They both reflect sometimes the culture out of which we speak, and they actually take their cue from that culture by inclining us to change the words, not to resist. I'll begin actually with the word community itself. This word community, if you traded is one of the most overused words imaginable. It has a very positive buzz. But that positive buzz has been separated from what a community actually means. By a community, I mean a body of people who are unified in ways of thought and the values they share and the things that matter. There will, of course, be many communities in that sense. Many different groups of people who are unified in this way. Actually, that's the original idea of community. But now the word community often slides into a different use. It captures simply, or you might say graces simply, some particular interest group. Let me give you two examples. The expression the gay community has been used in this connection. But of course, gay people are not unified in deep ways. They have, of course, some similar concerns. But there are wealthy, highly educated gay people. There are poor and disadvantaged gay people. And to use that term to, as it were, incorporate them all in something called community is precisely to disguise those differences. I was similarly conscious the years I lived in America about people using the term the black community, or sometimes the African American community. But of course, there were communities in the center of deeply impoverished cities, or I put it the other way around, impoverished communities deeply in the center of cities, who had almost no common ground at all with the wealthy, highly educated people, African Americans, who populated parts of Princeton where I was. But the use of the language community helpfully, or you might say unhelpfully, disguises those differences. So one thing we can do is watch how we talk, mind what we say. And that brings me now to the heart of what I wanted to think about and had been thinking about. The way in which the language that we use for both city life and church life might actually undermine the very thing it is our business to preserve and the thing that ultimately we have in common and want to share. Because in the proper sense, people need communities. They need to belong. They need places and not just apartments and houses in which they feel at home. They need places of which they can be proud and where other members of the community care. Now I want to say, and I think probably you will share my view of this, for all their weakness, for all their fragility, churches still are communities in that sense, that deep, proper sense. They are gathered around a supreme purpose, the worship of God. That is not everybody's purpose. The worship of God and the service of Christ, but those are genuinely, deeply unifying elements. That is why when people are lost and people are hungering and people are needy, an obvious, a good place, the right place to turn to look for community is in the church. That much persists for all the other weaknesses there may be. But we can inadvertently undermine that A distinction has grown up, which earlier generations would never have known, I think, between religion and spirituality. Religion is not really fashionable. Spirituality is pretty fashionable, actually. And when you look at surveys, and here I must admit I'm thinking mostly of surveys in America, which is what I happen to be most familiar with. When you look at those, you will find increasingly that people who wouldn't tick the religion box will tick the spirituality box. But when you look a little closer, you will see that that notion of spirituality is actually quite deeply individualistic. It has to do with individuals seeking their own spiritual goals. The churches sometimes, I know this often in my own experience, think that if only we could just latch on to this spiritual seeking, that would be where the future lies. But actually that spiritual seeking is itself part of the individuality, the individualism that is undermining community. The church's message has to be, you can belong to the body of Christ. So your spiritual seekings, your spiritual yearnings will be met in the community that is the body of Christ. That emphasis and that focus, I think, is what we can do something not to let go. And what we could do instead is allow the language of spirituality and seeking to take over. Now, what does this have to do with the city? How does it have anything to do with the secular city? And here I want to go back to language and my maxim, mind how you talk. I now live in Edinburgh, and I'm not going to refer directly to Aberdeen, far be it from me. I was struck that somebody somewhere in Edinburgh City Council has decided, presumably with full approval, that it's a good idea to have a kind of slogan on the different departments that is kind of going to speak to people in the streets. The first one that struck me was your council, your environment, on the Department of Environment Trust. The second one that struck me was when the roads were dug up and it said, your taxes, your drains. And what interested me was the use of your. Why did it not say our taxes, our drains? Why did it not say our council, our environment? Just listen to the different resonance that is. I think the answer to that question is because inadvertently and no doubt unintentionally, those responsible for the council had slipped into a consumerist mentality. They had slipped into the mentality that says, we basically are like a utility. Your electricity, your gas pipes, your water supply. It's not natural to say our electricity, our water supply. Incidentally, when you're thinking about this, you might, if you're thinking about the resonance here, you might see, just register how important it is in the political language that politicians, certainly in Scotland, regularly talk about our National Health Service. They use the language of belonging, owning, possessing. But when it comes to the city, and I just take this example from Edinburgh, it's as though the city was saying, we're just a service. And of course, then all sorts of questions arise, like, are you a good one? Do you give us value for money? Might you be privatized? Once you begin to think in terms of this is your council, your environment, your taxes, your drains, wait a minute, maybe we should be privatizing some of that. And that is walking down the road away from community and towards the consumer. Maybe we can do nothing to change this. But that is why I say at least the minimum we could do is watch how we talk. The church, I believe, still, as I've said, in its fragility and its weakness, still offers community. I believe that the city, for all the problems that beset it, could still offer community. I believe, furthermore, that community is the context in which individuals flourish. Not on their own, not seeking their own path, but together. That's not everybody's belief. We are talking about a culture that really does genuinely believe, quite long-standing one actually, really truly does believe in the autonomous individual and making your own way in this world and getting what you want. But I want to say, from a church's point of view, and to offer to the city, any city, the neighbourhood, this thought. We are, of course, blown by all sorts of trends and tendencies. But we can, if I may use, finally, some good religious language, we can still witness to the value and importance, as I would say, the spiritual centrality of community and communal life. We can still witness to that. But we will not do the right job of witnessing to it unless, as I say, we watch how we talk.
Professor Graham, thank you very much indeed. The Lord Provost and Lord Lieutenant of the City of Aberdeen, Councillor Barney Crockett, is known to many of us. I see you quite regularly walking around the streets of this city and count you as a friend. So we're very pleased that you're here with us this evening to respond to Professor Graham. Barney is a graduate of the universities of Aberdeen and Liverpool and the Open University. And in addition to his long service on Aberdeen City Council, he has served and continues to serve on many bodies and with different kinds of interests, including the Aberdeen City Heritage Trust, the Gordon Highlanders Museum Board, the Proctors Orphanage Trust, and the William Harvey Trust, and the World Energy Cities Partnership. He's a traveller of the world, representing the interests of Aberdeen, but also sharing his experience from this place. And I imagine might say something about that. Barney, you're very welcome among us.
Thanks very much for that. Of course, admonition to watch what you say is maybe particularly important to somebody who speaks an awful lot. So I'll have to bear that in mind very thoroughly. And I was minded when the professor was speaking there about you and yours. And I think it's very interesting because I think I was going to say, trust me, I'm a politician. Because I think that one of the things that lies behind that Edinburgh wording that you mentioned, and I had noticed myself, is maybe the reluctance of politicians to include themselves amongst others, not because, as may have been at one point, that they thought of themselves as somewhat elevated, but because, perhaps they feel that they have no credibility as being part of the us, part of the our, and that therefore they're on this treadmill trying to produce services that may or may not please their constituents, or as you might see it, they might see it, their consumers, to get a marginal, approval rating. Because I think it is once. I mean, Saul Bellow said that once our heroes were gods, then they were heroes, then they were ordinary people, and now they're slobs. The people that were in leadership are not maybe seen well, and we have to try and to do something about that, or to respond to that. I think that you mentioned that we are being more and more marginalised as consumers, and we feel this need for community. And I think that need for community is rooted. We need to be significant to other people, and love comes into that. And one of the things that I have been saying since Lord Provost is that we have probably, and I think, maximised the amount of resources that's going to go into public services. We can only get more benefit by having that love element to the fore. And I think, therefore, churches, driven communities, not just communities that exist, but that have a direction, that have a desire to do this, that they are going to be ever more important. And I would like to see, along with others, to see Aberdeen being prominent in that. And partly it's driven forward. Aberdeen is, many of you will think, unique in many ways, but it's unique in one very objective way, is that it's the most private sector orientated city in Europe. It has the smallest public sector for the biggest private sector of any city in Europe. And so we rely maybe on people from driven communities, from religious backgrounds, to provide maybe more important aspects of what we call services, relationships in the city. My wife isn't here just now because she's about to go around the streets of Aberdeen as a street pastor. In Aberdeen street pastors, lots of people have street pastors, but they play a bigger role proportionately in Aberdeen because of the nature of our city. Law and order tonight in the city of Aberdeen is going to be very largely in the hands of the people who are at the doors of the various nightclubs that have former churches and so on and so forth, and the link they have to the street pastors. And not only we have street pastors in Aberdeen, but now we also have school pastors, uncovering levels of need we didn't think were there, didn't know were there. We have retail pastors who try to work in the what you call the high street, or we all call the high street. But that's only one example of a lot of the things that go on, and included in the church here. And it did remind me tonight when we were thinking about this that I was about to say, that Professor said it, that we have two different aspects. We had a massive surfeit of churches because of what he called the bonanza, but we also had people trying to do the sort of things that we're speaking about in the 19th century, and in the Episcopalian Church as elsewhere, and trying to get that level of significance which we struggle to do today. And I've made the thread of my sort of law. Every Lord Provost tries to have a thread that flows through all of what they do in their provostship, and mine is to try and reach every congregation in the city and try and get that message that we are, it's our rather than your, and from whatever type of congregation. And I visited a church, some of you will know it, the City of God, in mainly I think in Holborn Street. And the people there are mainly from Nigeria. And I said, oh, it must be a Nigerian thing, a city of God, yeah? And he goes, no, look. And it's in the stained glass window, Aberdeen, 1906, the city of God. And part of their thinking was that we have relinquished that title, but they may help us, the missionaries that have come from Nigeria and elsewhere may help us to regain our position as the city of God. So I hope to learn as I go around more of all of that things. And I think again we mentioned about our speaker mentioned that more individualization and consumerism, and it did and how we've tried to process in the past. And I was reading an Aberdeen cleric of the 18th century, and he said about this individual, looking for your own individual spirituality, he said, you're worried about a tree when the forest is already sold. We have it's the forest that will be there. So I hope my response hasn't been too entirely incoherent and that we can have some questions. I'll just give you one other thing. You may hear me, I often speak about this because, again, about the nature of the city not just being a provider of services, being something beyond that, is that the symbolism of our city speaks to that. Now, I've got on my badge of office. This is the originally what a badge was, and it has Aberdeen's 2 coats of arms, a big one that you can see that you all know, and a little tiny one dangling there, which isn't usually seen in full size because it's not consonant with the modern values that we're touching there, because it's St. Nicholas raising 3 boiled babies back to life, which is not seen maybe as a media-friendly thing now, but it is important to remember that's the roots, that we have that in St. Nicholas, and the Lady Provost chain that she would be wearing if she wasn't trampling the streets just now has the 4 saints of Aberdeen. So we have long roots in these things, which we have to go beyond that individualism, I feel, and we must strive to do that. I hope that we can all engage in a discussion about that. But thank you so much for the invitation, and thanks very much for that talk. Thank you.
Now I want to invite you to ask one or both of our speakers questions, to draw from them further the things that they might have thought about, and to encourage them to continue their conversation with each other. Now, to do this, you need to raise your hand if you want to ask a question, and then Mark will bring a microphone to you so that we can hear what the question is. And so is there anybody that would like to ask one or both of our speakers something to open our general conversation? Okay, there's one here, and then after that we'll come to the front. It's okay.
Thank you very much, Bishop, and thank you to both to Gordon Graham and to Lord Provost for very stimulating contributions this evening. My question is this. I think, Gordon, the trend that you've outlined, with which I agree, has a longer pedigree than the internet, and could actually be traced back, or at least you could say it. Some writers and theorists have traced it back to the Reformation and the trends that were set off by that, and that was, in fact, there have been a lot of analyses of that since then. In the 20th century, you could look at the writings of Tawney, for example, his book, The Acquisitive Society, and there's the Religion and the Rise of Capitalism and related works. And I just wonder whether the development that we've seen represented technologically through the internet, smartphones, and the related trends that we've witnessed as a result actually have quite an old history and are the logical continuations of that history, and whether the corporate element of religion, and for that matter of enterprise, of civic life, and other aspects have to really recognise the cultural, philosophical and religious histories which have influenced them. And which are reflected also in part in poetry. I won't go into this now, but if you, for example, read the poem by Philip Larkin on churchgoing, there are resonances in that which reflect on the points you've made this evening. It's a really interesting lecture and very interesting thoughts around that, but I'm kind of just wondering, are we talking about a very significant, long-standing legacy that we've never really properly analysed in terms of modern life, communities and technology and so on?
Thank you. One moment. So, quite a long question. So, could you respond, particularly by paying attention to the question there? Is the roots of individualism in Scotland particularly influenced by the Scottish Reformation, given that it's something, individualism is something which we're seeing is a worldwide trend? Is there a particular Scottish take on this? So I'll begin, first of all, with you, Professor Graham. I'm coming in your direction after.
Well, let me just say, of course you're right, that the ways we think have long histories, and the influence of the Reformation and then other developments in the course of the 18th and 19th centuries have been very deep and important. I think, though, that a certain kind of consumerism has been accelerated, and it's been accelerated. You can see the acceleration since, broadly speaking, after the Second World War. And it has to do with rising levels of prosperity, combined with the political programs of those for whom economics have become immensely important. So if I just remark in passing, since this might, in a different world, have been Brexit Day, but if you look at the debates about this, it is quite depressing, amongst other things. It's quite depressing how much of that has been cast in terms of, so to speak, pounds and pence, purely economic benefits and purchasing power and buying and selling. Now, you mentioned poetry, and long ago Wordsworth had the line, buying and selling, we dispense our powers. Little we see in nature that is ours. And that idea of giving ourselves over to the commercialization of life, the buying and selling, where things are cast up now in terms of consumers, that I think has been seriously accelerated because of rising levels of prosperity, more spending money, and because the political agenda all over has become more and more and more, how's the economy doing? And in a way, one of the most significant things that was ever said was, in First President Bush's time, it's the economy, Stu. Well, if we got to that pitch as the heart of political life. So, to return to your question, Scotland at the time of the Act of Union was a lot poorer than England. And it remained a lot poorer, and parts of it remained a lot poorer long into the 19th century. And in fact, the real, as it were, upturn economy in Scotland, where there's much more general levels of prosperity, is relatively recent. So I wouldn't want to deny that deep influences like the Reformation were important, but the Reformation didn't really put people on their own at all. I mean, you think about a preacher like John Knox and so on, and the Old Testament dimension that he drew upon. The Old Testament, if you read the prophecies and the Psalms, it's driven again and again and again with a concern about the health and the sinfulness and the prosperity of the people, not individuals as such. So the Old Testament motif of the Reformation took the Scottish people and wanted them as a people to be saved in turn. So I don't deny what you say about deep roots, but I do think we have witnessed an acceleration, a dramatic acceleration, not just in individualism, but in consumerism.
I think in the short answer to your question would be yes, is my view, but because I think that the Reformation did spark off the focus on the individual. As was just said, Professor Graham, that it's not just about the individuals. That tension is set up between the individual and the community, and I think that has been the Scottish story since then. I think that the Act of Union is mentioned, and I mean, put fairly bluntly, until nearly that period, Scotland was the kind of Afghanistan of Europe, just people bumping one another off in a fairly random way. But it's with religious obscurantism to the fore. But that strange mixture of that obscurantism coming into the greater entity, and having sparking off the Scottish Enlightenment and all that about individualism. There are people here who know more about it, a lot more than me. An interesting thing to me is the local aspect of that, because you would have had that arguments going on when we were seething with the number of churches, when people were building, as was mentioned, their vanity projects. There were vanity projects often circulating around the issues that you're speaking about the relationship between the individual and the community, with people feeling real passion about it. I saw an interesting illustration just the other day that the Unitarian Church was quite an influential thing here, and he appealed, the illustration, it was in a local publication, the Evening Express or something, and it's saying that it's a massive congregation. He said these are all the people who don't otherwise go to church. They only go to, he's attracted this new folk. So there's an intense engagement about the individual, I think, in Scotland, but particularly in Aberdeen. And I think, I didn't make the connection until now. I don't know if there is any connection. But the second Labour Lord Provost of Aberdeen was a professor of theology, a Professor Graham. I don't know, there's no family link, is there? Yeah. But Professor Graham was a world-leading thinker on these issues, and was the longest-serving Lord Provost, I think, at that point. So maybe there's an indication there. So, yeah. So just to say, I think, the council has been involved in that over the years, looking at the individual and the community, the arguments about council housing, the arguments about how fast to demolish tenements, which were communities. Aberdeen was notably the slowest city in Britain in doing that, because some people felt the communities were worth preserving.
Well, could I just, that's a really, really interesting example, I think. And I was thinking about this today as I walked past. And again, this isn't just Aberdeen, but this, however poor and wretched the housing areas were, like in the Mount Hooley area or the Gorbals in Glasgow, the building of tower blocks was done with the best of intentions, but it was done thinking in terms of units, thinking in terms of units that would serve functionally better. And inadvertently, as we now know, they destroy communities. So I think it's important to see that this isn't as where people deliberately doing bad things or anything. It's that a way of thinking of the household and the individual as the essential unit of need. In that case, destroyed communities.
Thank you. Question here? Oh, yes. Yes, coming to you.
Time and time again, we hear that local churches have been complaining about the lack of young people attending church. Now, as Professor Graham pointed out, a lot of the youngsters now are into cafes on a Sunday morning with their mobile phones. How can we encourage them to become community-minded people and still involve them in what they're interested in, if you see what I'm trying to say.
I see exactly what you're trying to say, and so I want to, you know, I don't want to give any impression that I have any special solutions. That's why mine was a kind of modest recommendation. We should be careful how we talk about these things and make sure that we're not inadvertently feeding. But I do believe, and I was part of conversations about this in a completely different context last week, I do believe that until from both parents and social leaders, community leaders and churches, until it is said often enough, this is not the best way to go, we will not remedy this. And it's a matter of tremendous anxiety in some quarters that tiny children are now being given screens, and this is having a very serious effect on the development of the brain and so on and so forth. So until we get the message out, not a message that says first and foremost, hey, come to church. I mean, we're not there yet. Until we get out, look, let's recognize deep and serious anxieties about what is happening with our children and their belonging and the relationships in which they stand. Unless we get that out and keep repeating it, I think we won't get to the place that you want to get to.
Lord Provost, I wonder if you can, from your experience, tell us of examples in this city where children and young people are making an important contribution to civic life.
Yeah, I would hesitate, but yes, I can give you some examples because, as I said, I have a thread. I'm trying to visit places, so I can give you a wee bit about that. I think that action is a crucial element, and I think that not too far on the same street as this church, King's Community Church, has 7 services on a Sunday because they have so many people coming. In the 19th century, there was a famous Church of Scotland divine in Aberdeen who was disciplined for having 3 services because that was seen as making yourself a bit too self-important. So he actually gave the 3rd service standing on the step instead of in the pulpit, so he said it wasn't really preaching. So and again, the young people are attracted to getting beyond the individual, getting beyond that atomised individual. And that will often mean, in the first instance, it's very much about activity. And great things, can be achieved. I was really struck at one of my many, I have about 50 titles, just on 50 titles as Lord Provost. And one is I'm the Honorary President of the Royal Horticultural Society. Of Aberdeen. Yeah, you see that? No, but you should get very excited because it's an organisation 195 years old that has the royal stamp of approval in Aberdeen. And but there were children there from poorest part of the city, perhaps, who were engaged by a Christian organisation to help them with flowers and all the rest of it. And they had entries in the flower show, which I thought was another fantastic example. Yeah.
Any other questions? Yes, those 2. Yeah.
I was trying to reconcile your individualism communities as I believe in what you were saying about individuals seem to be taking over, especially since the smartphone has come in. And communities, as you explained, I kept thinking about, yes, communities are not the same. Grandmother, mother, daughter all used to live near one another in this but all separated. But I got to thinking about community centres, and I do know that the town at this moment have given a lot of money to each deprived community centre to try and encourage community to get together there, and they had to decide what they wanted for their community, whether it was a playground for the children or whatever. And this seems to be successful. I'm sure Provost will confirm what I mean by this. And when you mentioned, you were speaking more about the community, you said that they had different ideas about being a community. So, as I say, I was just trying to reconcile what you meant by community in comparison to this problem I have with individualism.
Well, thank you very much. I was really wanting to alert people to the way in which the term community can be extended in such a way that it loses what it really means. What the cases you are calling our attention to are genuine uses, proper uses of the word community. And I do think, and this is why the kind of example you have in mind is so important, and I think the same thing about churches. Community has to grow from below. It really has to rise from localities and from people. All the top-down programs and schemes and so on are not going to impose community ever. And so the kind of context you're thinking of, I think, is absolutely crucial. It's to find ways in the city and in the diocese, for that matter, of liberating and strengthening communities that grow from the bottom. And I think that often these little communities are A, they're very inspiring, but secondly, they're really full of promise. So I think, if I may say so, you're using the word in the right way. I was trying to just alluding to the fact that it can be misused in ways that make it meaningless.
Thank you.
Thank you. Since Mr. Crockett's here, something that really upsets me immensely is that when I lived in London, when I went to live in London, there was never anybody sitting homeless on the streets of Aberdeen, and I was utterly shocked when I came back from living in London to find all these people sitting on Union Street, and it just utterly breaks my heart. I can hardly walk down Union Street because of it. And I can't understand, why is the Town Council allowing it? I mean...
Yeah, there's a simple answer there, is that we're not allowed to disallow it. There's been an attempt.
Why, if there was real community, we would not. Right now, people are sitting in Union Street and they're freezing cold, and we are allowing it. And I see one homeless man who often sits outside a church which was actually designed by an ancestor of mine across from Midlands. I often think if my ancestor knew that somebody was sitting homeless outside at the church he designed, he'd be devastated.
Well, it sounds like a job for the churches, perhaps, but the key thing is that, to be honest, the honest truth is that years ago it wouldn't have been allowed, but now it's allowed, and people choose to do it.
But shouldn't the Town Council make certain that everybody has somewhere to go at night?
Sorry, I can't hear you.
Sorry, should the Town Council not be making absolutely certain that nobody has to sit homeless on Union Street?
Well, we can't.